Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday, November 20th, 2018, and now I'll ask you how you're doing. I almost forgot that. How are you doing? Are you doing any better now that you know that it's Tuesday, November 20th? Were you doing better before I told you? Does it make any difference what order I do these things in? I don't think so. I'm a superstitious guy, I guess. I guess this means it's going to be either the greatest show ever, possibly the worst. Who knows? I think everything will be okay. Flipping through the Twitter machine this morning, plenty going on and lots to catch up on. I will announce the success of my bid to tape a Wednesday morning program for you. So we at least have that. And we'll make an effort to try and squeeze in another one. As it turns out, it's extraordinarily difficult to do two shows in a single day and still do anything else with your life. And I don't know. We'll try it at least one more time. I have, I gotta say, I have my doubts about whether or not I'll be able to get a third one finished today for use either Friday or Thursday. Not sure exactly which option we'll go with. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Plenty to discuss today. And it being Tuesday, it looks like it's going to be you and me. So here we go. I'll be taking your suggestions, as always, on the KITM hashtag on Twitter. So if you got any ideas about which directions we might go, and I see that there are already a few lined up from yesterday, anything from this morning, I hope so. And, well, there's plenty. Something I picked up on yesterday, and most of the show is really about me not getting to things that I wanted to talk about the day before, and that's why I come back the next day. Something that is picking up steam, though, and really ought to be shared with you before it gets to be, let's say too late. Something weird happening in international circles. That's always the case. Let's see, where will we start with this one? We'll start with the story I grabbed a couple of days ago. This a November 17th piece in the Times. Is that right? The Times of London. Do I even get the whole story? I don't think I do. I think it's a subscription place. But they were the first ones, the first place I saw the story discussed, or the first tip I got on it. This is it. And we've discussed this. We're going to have to harken back. I'll ask you to harken way back to a show, a couple of weeks ago. And you'll recognize the basis of the story. And we spent a little bit of time discussing Interpol, the international police organization that, as you'll recall, doesn't actually have the power to arrest anybody, but they can issue essentially what are the equivalent of arrest warrants, I suppose, nationally and then, or internationally, and national member police organizations are then sort of responsible for, depending on how their justice departments or the equivalent of their justice departments rule on the validity of the arrest warrant and whether or not there are the correct extradition treaties, etc. They will, it's your only chance, essentially, Interpol, for getting other countries to do your police work and your arrest work for you if the subject you're looking for has either fled to or originally lived in, or whatever. They're in another jurisdiction, another country, and you can make that request, essentially. It's not a super robust system, but it tends to work, generally speaking. And, we learned a little bit about how the system works and what rights the other countries have in terms of evaluating the validity of the arrest warrant, and how sometimes the system can be gamed. And if I recall correctly, we read a piece a few weeks ago about how the Russians, in particular, tended to try to game the system. And if you were a dissident of some sort in Russia and fled from Russia, perhaps to the United States, let's say, in fear for your life or your freedom, because, of course, both are in jeopardy in Russia for whatever reason. Just being Russian is reason enough. We were sometimes getting these requests that essentially said that the Russians were willing to represent to Interpol that you were, in fact, criminal. They would find some way of criminalizing your activity, reporting it to Interpol, and basically hoping that other countries would do their work for them in rounding up their political prisoners. And that was troubling and worrisome and wrong and an abuse of the system. So, what sort of problems are we facing now? Well, as it turns out, a Russian police official is in line to head Interpol this next time around. Remember, we read, I think what we were reading was the story of the Chinese national who was the head of Interpol and who went missing. That is, he was rounded up, I think, by the Chinese themselves and had to resign or was forced to resign from the position. And now the story is a Russian official is in line to take over, and it's sparking some concerns. The way the Times reported it here in their brief opening paragraphs that I'm allowed to read without subscribing, a Russian official is a favorite, and you know how they spell that, to be the next head of Interpol in spite of concerns that Moscow has been using the international policing agency to target political opponents. British officials expect Alexander Prokopchuk, I'm hoping that's close to actual pronunciation, he's 56 years old, a veteran of Russia's Interior Ministry, to be elected as the next Interpol president next week. The election follows the disappearance of Meng Hongwei, the president who resigned last month and is being investigated by China's anti-corruption authorities. Mr. Prokopchuk's appointment would represent a significant victory for the Kremlin after criticism of the Russian state for abusing the agency's Red Notice system. You remember that. That's about all that the Times will allow me to read on that subject. However, I do have a few more pieces that I guess will shed a little bit more light on the subject. Let's see. Skipping over a few other things that have intervened. I know I saw, here we are, at least two other takes on this. One from Bloomberg, an opinion piece by Eli Lake, which doesn't actually thrill me to death, and one from Newsweek, where another person doesn't really thrill me to death. Bill Browder, you know that name. He's been wrapped up in the Trump-Russia story for a long time. Bill Browder, the millionaire, billionaire, bazillionaire who employed Sergei Magnitsky, who of course was murdered by the Russian police, and who the namesake of the Magnitsky Act, of course. And how ironic, I'm sure in his mind, that dangerous and terrifying, I would imagine, that the Russians would end up with the presidency of Interpol. And he says in the headline right here, in a piece in Newsweek by Christina Maza on the 19th, that's yesterday, Bill Browder says Russia accusing him of poisoning lawyer who was tortured in prison is part of Putin's vendetta. That actually doesn't sound like it makes a whole lot of sense in the context of the Interpol story. Why did I think that? I mean, it's terrifying and worrisome, and I may have grabbed that actually out of a tweet that was talking about the worries that would arise from having a Russian official there we are. They do mention him being slated to take over the presidency of Interpol and it being a particular problem. I guess what I'll do is perhaps we'll segue to that, because that's got a whole other issue wrapped up in it. And we'll take a look at the Eli Lake piece in Bloomberg, which is comes at it from a more straightforward perspective, at least headline-wise. Don't let Russia lead Interpol. The international law enforcement organization is dangerously close to losing its legitimacy. And how dangerous for all of us that many of the remaining contenders for superpower themselves individually are losing their legitimacy as national governments, and international agencies losing it at the same time, which, of course, I suppose, I am told would suit the Russian agenda just fine, but who knows? Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, and I'm listening to biased partisans, but hasn't led to anything good so far. Let's take a look at Eli Lake's picture here. Imagine an alternative history of New York City in which John Gotti becomes police commissioner and obtains arrest warrants for the U.S. attorneys who prosecuted the Gambino crime family. Something like that is on the verge of happening to the international law enforcement organization known as Interpol. It also is something like what's happening to the national organization known as the United States government, now that mobster Donald Trump is in charge and thinks he can simply order whatever he wants to happen and pardon anybody who gets caught up in the system because he doesn't understand it from the beginning. On Wednesday, delegates to Interpol's annual convention will be casting votes on its next president after China disappeared its last one. Don't forget about that. Meng Hongwei in September. Meng's wife says she has not heard from him since he flew to Beijing 2 months ago, and she fears he is dead. And why wouldn't he be dead, given what we've learned about how Saudi Arabia treated Jamal Khashoggi? The incident put Interpol on life support. Now, Interpol's member states are reportedly poised to elect the former head of Russia's Interior Ministry, Alexander Prokopchuk, to replace Meng. His victory would pull the plug on Interpol. It's not just that Russia itself has abused Interpol's system of issuing notices for arrest warrants to the national police of member states, known as red notices. There is literally no one in the world who bears more direct and personal responsibility for Russia's abuse of Interpol than Alexander Prokopchuk, writes the Heritage Foundation's Ted Bromund. And you all know and love the Heritage Foundation, right? Well, Prokopchuk heads the government bureau that sends law enforcement information from Russia to Interpol. The most famous victim of this kind of abuse is the hedge fund manager William Browder. Now, that will give us some context for skipping back later on to the Newsweek story. Browder's lawyer, just as a refresher, Sergei Magnitsky, died in a Russian prison in 2009 after exposing embezzlement by government officials. Browder then lobbied, tirelessly and successfully, for the Magnitsky Act, which imposes sanctions against government officials who commit grave human rights abuses. Russia has issued red notices for Browder, an American-born citizen of the UK. But no one would dare capture and kill a resident of the UK or the United States and just murder them outright, right? Meanwhile, Russia has failed to arrest the many officials already named and shamed through these Magnitsky actions. In fact, on the eve of the Interpol vote, a Russian prosecutor filed new charges against Browder, accusing him of running a multinational money laundering operation. See, they're into protection too, maybe. In an added flourish, Russian prosecutors said it was likely that Browder himself had poisoned his own lawyer. And now the Newsweek overhead headline begins to make some sense, right? Already, Ukraine has threatened to leave Interpol if Prokopchuk is elected as its next president. The U.S. and its allies should do the same. I'm sure that would only thrill the Russians to break another international cooperative organization up that way. Western democracies still provide nearly 80% of Interpol's annual budget. That money would be better spent as seed funding for a new international law enforcement organization that bans officials from corrupt authoritarian states instead of electing them to leadership positions. Even if Prokopchuk is defeated this week, the damage to Interpol is already done. Just last month, another authoritarian state kidnapped and disappeared the previous Interpol president, so not exactly a safe perch, right? So far, China has paid no price for its crime. The fact that Prokopchuk has come this close suggests the rot inside Interpol is irreversible. Time to start over. When Nazis took over the leadership of Interpol's predecessor, yes, you heard that right, Nazis took over the leadership of Interpol's predecessor, known as the International Criminal Police Congress. Interesting. Most nations withdrew their membership. Interpol was reborn in 1946 after the Nazis were defeated in World War II. It's a good time to start something new then. There is still a need for an international organization that enables police agencies to share information. Interpol is no longer that organization. So America should lead the effort to build a new one. One of its first acts should be to issue a red notice for Alexander Prokopchuk for impersonating a cop. That is a fascinating story on story on story inside story. And it's like Inception. Could be a movie if you really, you'd have to think it through a little bit. But imagine that, in the post-war establishment of Interpol, you're putting this thing together and, obviously to a good purpose. And then post-Soviet era, you're, I don't know. Did we have, was the Soviet Union a member state of Interpol prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union? I can't really remember. Obviously, if the Soviet Union was ever a member, it was prior to the dissolution, yes. But you know what I'm getting at here. I'm curious how long they've been a member state. But the idea of the International Police Organization slowly being taken over by authoritarian state criminals and using the organization itself to disappear the head of Interpol and then trying to replace, thinking about it just in terms of perspective here. I assume that in most of official Russia, they view Alexander Prokopchuk as a valid, like an official of a legitimate regime, even though perhaps we shouldn't. But they probably, I don't know. I assume that in Russia, they're pretty clear on Donald Trump not being particularly legitimate, right? Especially if they know, yeah, we chose him. We know he's not legitimate. He's a Russian agent. We love it, but you should be mad. You have every right to be upset about this. I don't know what Russian popular opinion of him really is, but I'm just interested in the idea of one side saying, yeah, we should elect Alexander Prokopchuk and use the international red notice system to find the real criminals, political dissidents from our country who are abusing our system. And the other response is, no, we should start a new one, and we should issue a red notice for Alexander Prokopchuk and arrest him. And the whole thing started on flipping the idea of international policing on its head by putting John Gotti in charge and issuing, arrest warrants for all the U.S. attorneys who previously were responsible for law enforcement. It's very weird, and it gets you. It's a great analogy to the weird gray area that our constitutional system affords us, that at a certain level, the great documents are all LOL, YOLO, nothing matters material, right? You get 5 robed justices to say everything you've previously understood is wrong and in fact reversed. And the state of the law is the opposite of what you grew up believing. And there's no appeal from that. And you can either sit there and say, well, I just misunderstood everything from the beginning of my life to this point. Or say, no, you're standing this whole system on its head is perhaps criminal in itself. And you all need to be impeached and tried and imprisoned, or whatever it is, whether you're talking about actually doing that to justices or to the people who installed them. And it's just one of those weird moments where you have to decide for yourself whether you've been gaslighted for your entire life or not, and whether everything you've ever been taught about what the law is and how it works is wrong. It's a nice crystallization of that problem. All right, let's jump over to the Newsweek article to see a little bit about how the day-to-day mechanics of pulling off such a stunt might work. Again, remember the weird headline. Bill Browder says Russia accusing him of poisoning lawyer who was tortured in prison is part of Putin's vendetta. This is the sort of mischief you can make if you have a suit and the trappings of a government that you can put on and have a press conference, and some portion of the world believes you are a legitimate nation state. Okay? But in fact, you're just a international criminal organized crime syndicate, let's say. Russia's prosecutor general, announced new charges against American financier Bill Browder on Monday, accusing the longtime critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin of poisoning his own lawyer and running a criminal network. Now, you would have to be a pretty serious criminal to poison your own lawyer to pull it off, especially if he's in a Russian jail and you're an American-born UK citizen. You're not going to have much access to those Russian jails, but if you're a billionaire, you've got reaches and tentacles everywhere, I suppose, and you can certainly James Bond your way into poisoning your own lawyer so that you can frame the entire Russian government for the crime of murdering him, so that you can lobby the American government and other Western democracies to impose sanctions on the individual actors making up the Russian government. It could happen, or it could have happened the way we heard it the first time. The opposite way. All right. So that's the accusation. The charges are the latest in the ongoing battle between Browder, who was once Russia's largest foreign investor, and the Russian government. Don't do anything in Russia. It's very dangerous. Browder opened a company called Hermitage Capital Management in Russia in the mid-1990s, as Moscow was caught in the throes of an emerging open market. So, I guess you shouldn't lose sight of what was happening at the beginning here. Essentially, you have post-Soviet Russia opening up its markets, and it's having tremendous difficulty because they've never, in recent memory, they have no experience with a modern-day open market. And under the guise of a sort of idealistic altruism, as they would have you believe it, American and other Western investors, what they really saw was the opportunity to ravage the emerging Russian economy. They would have, this would be a state thrown open to the free markets, and which would have no legitimate regulatory state in place to prevent any sorts of rampant abuses that a manipulative and sophisticated investor could use to siphon off massive amounts of wealth from the state, which is something that both American and other Western billionaires realized, and former Soviet apparatchiks who were not yet billionaires realized if they could raise the capital to buy off pieces of the newly privatized government, they could siphon that money off themselves. So it opened an enormous competition among financiers of a more legitimate stripe, although, there were no better people, and less scrupulous, let's say, mobster types. And then, of course, they were competing on the same platform, and they began to adopt one another's tactics because there was no one there to stop them. All right. So what happens is he opens up Hermitage Capital Management in Russia in the mid-1990s because he knows he can exploit a emerging market with weak regulatory and legal regimes. For years, he was a supporter of Putin, who Browder said would reform the country by taming the oligarchs who had emerged victorious but ruthless from the fall of communism. The mistake, of course, was that the temptation to become the richest of all of the oligarchs was enormous, and it ensnared Putin, even or could possibly have been his plan all along. And Browder, the genius, apparently didn't see it, or was willing to look the other way because Putin was willing to help him continue to siphon money out of the Russian economy. But we'll go back to the article. As Browder would later describe in numerous interviews, his opinion about Putin changed when he came to believe the president planned to be the biggest oligarch of them all. Aha! The Russian government, led by Putin, had started seizing the assets of wealthy businessmen whose loyalty was suspect. By 2005, it was Browder who had fallen out of the Kremlin's good graces. He was deported from the country, and his company was subsequently raided. It's beginning already to have that sort of weird inside-out Inception feel. According to Browder, Hermitage Capital Management was fraudulently re-registered under the name of a convicted criminal and used to apply for a $230 million tax rebate. Browder's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who allegedly blew the whistle on this tax fraud scheme, was then arrested and died in prison under suspicious circumstances. So that opens things up a bit and sets the table for accusations and counter-accusations about exactly how he died. Browder has spent most of the past decade lobbying foreign governments to punish those he believes are responsible for the lawyer's death. His work resulted in the passage of the 2012 Magnitsky Act, which barred entry to the U.S. and froze the assets of 18 Russian government officials believed to be connected to the case. You know this background. The law was expanded to become the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016, and now about 44 accused human rights abusers are under its legislation. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. We cut out rather quickly, and so I mangled the end of the paragraph that I was reading. I was mentioning about the expansion now of the Magnitsky Act to the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016, and now around 44 accused human rights abusers from around the world have been sanctioned under the legislation. I sort of mangled the syntax of that one, and now I'll be like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, being ridiculed mercilessly, except it's not really working or engaging anybody in or persuading anybody about her. I guess she's been doing some really interesting stuff lately. I guess she's been doing she used Periscope for it, or anyway, she does these sort of live stream video streams of her musing about her day at the end of the day, and it's usually a kind of an interesting day. I mean, somebody was pointing out what she's basically doing is like live video blogging the process of becoming a congressperson, being oriented as a brand new member to the way things work, which would be eye-opening for just about anybody. I'm very interesting to follow along with, I'm sure. And what she was mentioning something about, I guess she crossed up the verbiage with respect to distinguishing between the chambers of the legislature and the legislature as one branch of government, and ended up, mangling it and saying something about chambers of government, and, see, she doesn't know what she's talking about. That's just slip of the tongue stuff, but hey, I know all about that, and so do you. Let's return, though. Just wanted to mention that. I do think what she's doing there is pretty interesting. It's a great idea. It seems a little gimmicky at first, but I mean, who wouldn't want to know about what your day is like when you're going through new member orientation in Congress. Well, okay, millions and millions of people wouldn't care to know that, but you and I would want to know. From that, we extrapolate that everyone would want to know. Okay, back to Interpol. The fact that Russia has invested resources into lobbying against the Magnitsky Act, famously sending Kremlin-linked lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya to discuss the bill with members of the Trump campaign in June of 2016, very important, hints at how much the Russian government would like to see the law overturned. Browder, meanwhile, continues to lobby for a European version of the Magnitsky Act. In a message to Newsweek, Browder said that the latest charges against him were in direct response to his lobbying efforts. Since the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, Putin has made it his single largest foreign policy priority to have the Magnitsky Act repealed. So that begins to put some context to the Trump Tower meeting, of course. He's also been on a personal vendetta against me. Tomorrow, the Dutch government will be introducing an EU Magnitsky Act proposal to all EU member states, and these latest bizarre allegations are an emotional reaction to that, Browder told Newsweek. According to the version of events put forward by the Russian government, it was Browder who stole from Russia. He has been charged with tax evasion and sentenced twice in absentia, once to 9 years in prison. Monday's charges allege that Browder was part of a criminal organization that aimed to embezzle money from Russia, and that he may have been behind Magnitsky's death in prison. And I guess the kernel of truth that's supposed to underlie all of that is, well, Bill Browder actually kind of did aim to embezzle money from Russia, but he aimed to do it in a way that would have, I assume it was his aim to do it in a way that would be able to take advantage of the cover of an undeveloped governmental regulatory system that simply hadn't gotten around to declaring the way he meant to siphon wealth off of the former Soviet Union's governmental structure was illegal yet. They just hadn't gotten around to realizing that that was a serious danger in a free market society and designing the legislation to prevent it. And he knew it. And, well, if it's not on the books, then it's not a crime. And if it's not a crime, then I'm not a criminal. And if I'm not a criminal, then those who are criminals are different from me, and I get to point the finger at them and say they go to prison and I don't because I'm the first mover. That's our system. Okay, just consider that for a while. Anyway, this is part of what makes this story fascinating to me. It's just a matter of who can seize the reins and convince others that they're the legitimate source of defining what's a crime and who's a criminal. Okay, back to the article. During a joint press conference between President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Helsinki in June, the Russian president used the public pulpit to request an opportunity to send officials to question Browder. Trump agreed at first, but he later backtracked after widespread outrage over the prospect of Russia questioning U.S. citizens. He agreed because, I don't know, Putin asked me, and he's a strongly strong guy, and I said yes. And then people reminded him, oh, there are implications, there's sovereignty, what's that? Oh, it's this really interesting concept you should know about as president. And, oh yeah, okay. At least they talked him out of that one. Instead, he started flirting with the idea of letting the Russians interrogate our former ambassador to Russia. And that, it took him a while longer to dissuade him of. Moscow, meanwhile, has used its membership in Interpol to pursue the financier, who now resides in the United Kingdom. Back to Interpol. Browder occasionally had been detained while traveling, but then later released when officials from various European countries came to the opinion that Russia was using Interpol as a means to persecute a political opponent. See? They kept detaining him every time he would cross a border somewhere because there was a red notice on the guy. And then they would realize, oh, yeah, it's a Russian red notice. That's BS. That's cheating. On Monday, Russian prosecutors said they will put Browder on a wanted list and that they expect Interpol to cooperate. It's interesting. I mean, you wonder about whether, from the Russian perspective, if there's anybody that really and truly believes that Browder is the criminal in all this, how frustrating must that be to not be able to get an international police organization to work by the book. Whereas from the other perspective, you say, well, how wise it appears for an international police organization to decouple itself from the usual fixation with operating by the book and saying, well, the system will vindicate you in the end. You just have to abide your time and tell it to the judge. But instead, they actually give a legalistic interpretation to things, stepping out of the boundaries of mere police and doing a little bit of legal work there and saying, sure, the book, by the book it says we're supposed to honor this red notice and make this arrest and detain this guy and turn him over to Russian authorities. However, everyone knows that blah, blah, blah. And they absolve themselves of responsibility for executing those red notices. And it sounds like a good thing. It seems like they're probably right. I mean, have I been propagandized into believing that's the case? The Russians would certainly tell you yes, if they were listening. Russia, are you listening? They're probably not. A Russian official named Alexander Prokopchuk has been slated to take over the presidency of Interpol after the Chinese head of the organization, Meng Hongwei, resigned and then disappeared mysteriously last month. Not much discussion of that here. Many analysts say the appointment of a Russian, particularly a veteran of the country's interior ministry like Prokopchuk, could provide ample opportunity for Russia to abuse Interpol. That's a quick glossing over of Meng Hongwei, but I guess Newsweek is more focused on the Russian issue here. Interpol's role in global law enforcement is dependent upon the institution's credibility and impartiality. Jonathan Reich, an attorney who represents Russian business persons and anti-corruption dissidents who have been targeted via Interpol, told Newsweek. So he's going to tell you that, obviously. Allowing Russia, which is alleged to regularly abuse Interpol's system for political persecution, to assume the presidency of the organization would grievously impair Interpol's credibility and undermine effective cooperation of law enforcement officials. Left unsaid here is that it would also be extraordinarily dangerous to allow Russia, which is alleged to regularly abuse Interpol's system and pretty much anything else that it can for political persecution. It would be a bad thing if they were able to, let's say, manipulate the elections of the presidency, for the presidency in the United States of America and elect a puppet who would enthusiastically cheerlead for Russia's ability to abuse Interpol's system for political persecution because they would be likely to use it in ways that would personally advantage this new president as well. What a mess that would be. Anyway, we're just about done here. Browder, meanwhile, did we finish up this one? Yes. Allowing Russia. Okay, right. So Browder, meanwhile, agreed that allowing Russia to take charge of Interpol could lead to politically motivated use of the organization or enhance or further their politically motivated use of the organization, I guess. Russia has made 7 abusive attempts to have me arrested since 2013 on politically motivated charges. If Russia is allowed to take over Interpol, it's like the mafia taking over global law enforcement, Browder told Newsweek. And that's a good parallel. And as a matter of fact, that was the lead of the Eli Lake piece, too. So I don't know whether that was coordinated or not. I'm just saying that several people have reached the same conclusion, and, well, now you can too. But that's a very weird and scary illustration of just how crazy things can get at the right level. You know what I mean? Okay. There's much more, and more things to get to. Let's see. Here's an interesting piece. that has gotten a little bit of attention in the last day or two, and I think it properly encapsulates things. Not a new story, nothing I need to bring your attention to as a new issue, but a good treatment of an old and ongoing issue. In The Atlantic, Derek Thompson, writing the article entitled "Trump's Lies Are a Virus and News Organizations Are the Host. Journalists have become complicit in spreading the president's falsehoods and conspiracy theories. Here's how they can do better." And I think it's also interesting to read in the context of the fight over Jim Acosta, the issuance of a new set of rules that the White House purports to be interested in enforcing on all journalists dealing with the president and the White House press office, which includes a rule against follow-up questions and basically says we'll revoke your press pass and throw you out if you fight us on this. If you try to ask a follow-up question, even if we evade your question, or if you say something like, please address the question I actually asked you, that's a breach of decorum and can get you thrown out. It's questionable how well that will work, and an open question about whether or not the White House Correspondents Association will accept this. But another piece of recent context, apparently we learned yesterday that the White House Correspondents Association, which has its annual dinner, which is inexplicably televised and watched by dozens, I'm guessing, will not be having a comedian hosting the event and doing a routine or involved in the event at all. As a matter of fact, it's been their tradition. Sometimes comedians, some better than others. But they've now run into so much trouble, in their view, with the comedians that they are going comedianless. They are instead going to have a event hosted by a presidential scholar, a scholar of the presidency, I guess. And that sounds entertaining. I can't wait to tune in for another one of those. Well, they keep calling it Nerd Prom. I guess this time it'll be for real nerds, and therefore no one will watch it. Maybe they'll drop that stupid name for it once and for all. Anyway, just tangential issues. And we're all disappointed in the White House Correspondents Association here for this one. Okay, so Trump's lies are like a virus and news organizations are the host, says Derek Thompson. Here's what that means. I think you get it right away, but here's the additional verbiage on it. The news media today face an epistemic crisis. Everyone loves the weird modifiers for crisis these days. How to publish the president's commentary without amplifying his fabrications and conspiracy theories. I think you're all familiar with the problem here. One flashpoint came several weeks ago when President Donald Trump told Axios reporters that he planned to use an executive order to end birthright citizenship because, as he put it, quote, "We're the only country in the world where a person comes in and has a baby and the baby is essentially a citizen." On Twitter, Axios CEO and co-founder Jim Vandehei wrote, "Exclusive, Trump to terminate birthright citizenship." As many journalists quickly pointed out, this was multi-layered malarkey. That's a long way to go for alliteration, but okay. The president was proposing an unconstitutional means of obliterating the 14th Amendment on the basis of a falsehood. More than 24 countries in the Western Hemisphere have unrestricted, oh my goodness, jus soli laws. Oh my goodness, is that Latin? But okay, unrestricted citizenship based on birthright, okay? Jus soli. I'm not certain how you would pronounce that. We could look it up, but we're not going to do that. Like the U.S. So, okay. Like the U.S., we won't look anything up. Axios was treating as fact a haphazard plan in search of an impossible outcome justified by a false assertion. You see, Axios took about as much grief as it deserved, but as others have shown, it's far from the only media outlet whose headlines and tweets are guilty of passing along Trump's falsehoods as straightforward and newsworthy or noteworthy quotes. But just to be clear about that, right, to say after the interview that Trump to terminate birthright citizenship, something that couldn't be done by one person, couldn't be done by executive order, was furthermore ingrained in our fabric by the Constitution, and also was being justified by the fake claim that only the U.S. allows birthright citizenship. So similarly, we were finding other outlets doing the same thing, right? Not just Axios, but where all the Axios people came from was doing the same thing. Politico. When Trump incorrectly described the GOP health bill as covering pre-existing conditions, Politico simply declared Trump guarantees coverage for people with pre-existing conditions in healthcare bill. Except, he said that. The bill didn't do that, and they didn't know how to handle it in the headline. When Trump falsely took credit for Ford moving a plant from Kentucky to Mexico, When Trump falsely took credit for Ford moving a plant from Kentucky to Mexico, I think that he was trying to prevent that from happening, and he claimed credit for that. Because ABC News reported Donald Trump takes credit for keeping a Kentucky Ford plant from moving to Mexico. There we are. I guess that's what actually happened. Although, you know what? With this guy, you can't tell. Imagine that. Ford moves the plant from Kentucky to Mexico, and Trump says, no, they didn't, and I'm the reason they didn't. That would be, I guess, even worse. Maybe it did happen that way. Who knows? When Trump claimed without evidence, who knows? There's history and you can look it up, but you know how we are about that. There's no proof of anything. LOL, YOLO, nothing matters. When Trump claimed without evidence that millions of people voted illegally in the 2016 election, CBS News tweeted, quote, Donald Trump, millions voted illegally for Hillary Clinton. When Trump claimed dubiously that he would sever ties with his businesses, it was reported as straightforward fact by CNN. The headline, Trump cutting ties with businesses. And the AP's headline, Trump says he's leaving businesses to focus on presidency. That brings us to Monday, when Trump called ballots cast in the Florida Senate election massively infected by fraud. ABC News and Bloomberg both quoted the president's accusation in their headlines, but neither noted that it was baseless. Once again, journalists on Twitter erupted with outrage that these headlines failed to call out the conspiracy theory, the motivations behind the conspiracy, or the actual truth. Instead, there is no evidence of any voter fraud. Indeed, there is no evidence of any voter fraud whatsoever in the Florida Senate election. This bickering might seem like inside baseball among reporters. It doesn't. On the basis that headlines and tweets are not exactly capital J journalism, but for many readers, they're even more important than the actual articles. As the Washington Post reported, about 60% of people acknowledge that they read only the headlines of news articles. If some of those respondents were embarrassed to tell the truth, as they should be, the real number might be even higher. It's worse on Twitter, where the most viral tweets typically have a click-through rate of less than 10%, which means that more than 90% of any given tweet's audience never actually reads the article. Clearly, headlines and tweets belong at the heart of any discussion of modern news ethics. Hey, I guess that's part of the value of Kagro in the morning here. Then I always wonder how much value there really is in my reading articles to you when you could certainly be reading them yourselves. But everybody's busy these days. And I guess if 90% of people are simply seeing headlines and don't have time to read the articles, and that includes me. For the most part, I have not read the articles until I do it for you on the show. So this show is as much a service to myself, I guess, as it is to anyone else. I don't want to be, to the extent I can do anything about being in the 90%, this is it. Otherwise, I'm sure without the discipline of having to do this show, I would be skipping even more articles. But I enjoy, right? I want to read them, and now I have but I rarely have the excuse, but the show creates an excuse. It's interesting to think about. Back to the article. The most recent controversy provides the perfect metaphor. Perfect. Great. For Trump's part symbiotic, part parasitic relationship with the media. Infection. In epidemiology, a virus cannot multiply on its own. First, it must find a host, whose cellular machinery it commandeers to reproduce. For a virus, all distribution, all amplification is infection. Right? So there are viruses that basically say, who cares what they print so long as they get the DNA coding right, I guess, right? So it is for Trump. So it is for Trump. That is how you would actually read that one. The president's conspiratorial language is an odious virus that has found a variety of hosts in the U.S. media ecosystem. The traditional news media amplify his words for a variety of reasons, including newsworthiness. He is, after all, the president, they claim, I'll add. Easy ratings. Cable news audiences have soared in his term. And old-fashioned peer pressure. The segment producers lament. If everybody else is carrying Trump, shouldn't we? But a virus doesn't just borrow a host's cellular factory to reproduce. It often destroys the host in the process. So, too, does the president seek to destroy the traditional news media that have often amplified his messages. He attacks journalists, calling them fake news and enemies of the people, bars critical reporters from the White House, and convinces his followers that the news media are inherently corrupt. The attacks are working. 3/4 of the GOP now say that news organizations make up anti-Trump stories, and about half of Republicans recently said that articles that cast their favored political group in a negative light are always fake news. The traditional news media are thoroughly infected by the Trump virus. It is not only spreading the disease of the president's lies, but also suffering from a demise of public trust, at least among 1/2 of the electorate. In normal times, there is little question about how to quote a sitting president. When the commander-in-chief says newsworthy things, the press quotes his words accurately. That suffices for responsible coverage. But these are not normal times. What's different is that the President of the United States is today the single most potent force for misinforming the American public, and he does exactly that on a daily basis. The press critic Jay Rosen told me. You can say politicians have always lied. Look at LBJ in Vietnam, Nixon, and Watergate. But this combination of elements has not been seen before. Indeed, in the past few weeks, Trump has averaged more than 100 lies per week in public statements. One solution to something like this is selective abstinence. Some commentators have adapted to the new normal by simply avoiding the president's language when possible. I don't go out of my way to play tape of the president speaking, MSNBC's Rachel Maddow said on her show. The president very frequently says things that aren't true. He admits that he says things that aren't true, and I feel like on this show, I'd like you to be able to trust me to give you true information. There's the silent treatment, and then there's the truth treatment. When traditional news outlets have to cover breaking news throughout the day, the linguist George Lakoff has proposed that they use a truth sandwich, which of course, means nothing to most people in the first instance, which is always ironic to me because George Lakoff thinks, his whole thing is about breaking through with your messaging in the first instance. And yet he keeps relying on these goofy metaphors that need explanation. But okay. That would mean, truth sandwich that is, would mean bracketing the president's unreal statements with slices of reality. For example, if the president claims that the GOP health care bills expand insurance coverage, parenthetically, they do not, the AP or a similar source could tweet GOP health plan still reduces coverage. Trump claims otherwise, but provides no evidence. The Toronto Star journalist Daniel Dale has made it his mission to fact-check the president in extended Twitter threads, often while Trump is still on the stump. Hey, that rhymes. In an essay for the Washington Post, he wrote that since the president tells the same falsehoods over and over, the task is simple. If, Sisyphean, we're talking about Sisyphus here. I don't think I've ever used Sisyphean. Okay. I don't think U.S. media outlets have been persistent enough in fighting a daily battle for truth itself, he writes. We read the article, of course. In 2017, he averaged 3 false claims per day. In 2018, it's about 9 per day. In the month leading up to the midterms, a staggering 26 per day. The president has made more than 5,000 false or misleading claims in less than 2 years in office, according to the Post. It's not obvious that fact-checking is always effective against the Trump virus. On the one hand, there is considerable cognitive research to suggest that fact-checks can backfire. Several studies have found that repeated phrases and ideas create a sense of familiarity in the mind, and familiarity can create the illusion of truth. That's because many people, particularly the elderly and less educated, easily conflate familiarity, that sounds familiar, with factuality. That sounds about right. Easy to see how that can happen. On the other hand, in one of the first studies of fact-checking, the political scientists Brendan Nyhan, you've heard of him, and Jason Reifler, R-E-I-F-L-E-R, Jason, let me know, found that at least some people really do change their minds when confronted with new facts. Phew, that's good. The researchers created a panel of participants that approximated the political and demographic distribution of the U.S. Wow, that's some task. Then they exposed the treatment group to recent fact checks and measured whether their opinion about those facts, or about fact-checking in general, had changed. Democrats, who hold more favorable views of fact-checkers than Republicans, were more likely to change their minds after reading a fact-check. Republicans' knowledge increased most when the fact-checks reinforced their biases. I believe we may have heard about that study, although who knows? We certainly feel it intuitively. And, hey, it sounds familiar, so it must be true. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Rich Radio. I just checking the KITM hashtag and Neil Ideologue. And have you changed your moniker these days, or do I misremember this? It says David identified the Lakoff paradox, and I wasn't even aware that there was one. But is that right? Is that what the thing I was talking about how weird it seemed to me? That Lakoff kept saying you got to use language that cuts through and communicates directly and on a level that doesn't require parsing, but he keeps illustrating the need to do so with weird metaphors that make people say, what the hell are you talking about? I don't know whether it struck me at first, but just thinking about it just now, I guess I'm way behind on this. If it's got a name, the Lakoff paradox. But now that I think about the presentation that made him famous, don't think of an elephant. Remember that was the title of his book, right? Don't think of an elephant. And everybody was like, what the F does don't think of an elephant mean? And, I mean, it's an understandable concept. It's just like, I don't understand why, if we're supposed to, be able to just cut straight through with our language, why it took 10 minutes to explain to me that we were supposed to cut straight through. All right. Well, let's find out what else is going on here. The mighty OCD tells me that sends me a please stand by notice with the KITM hashtag. Are we off the... you can't answer this if we're off the air. All right. Well, if you're listening to the podcast later because the broadcast was interrupted, you'll know what we're talking about. The rest of you who are just listening to the podcast, if you listen to both, you're on the inside. If you are just listening to the podcast, you'll never know, because now I told you. All right. Well, I ruined the whole test. Anyway, let's continue with this article because it seems to be rather lengthy, and you know what happens if we get distracted. We won't finish. All right. Where we left off, we were... Oh, I think I scrolled down a little bit to see how long the article was. We had just told ourselves about the study conducted by Brendan Nyhan and the other guy, with whom we're not familiar, so we don't think of him as very important. Brendan Nyhan is a huge figure to us because his name is familiar, because Greg says it all the time. Familiarity means it's right. Jason Reifler, never heard of the guy. I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry, Jason, but it's just true, but it's truthy that I have never heard of you. Now I have, and I still don't remember. Okay. It was their study that says that people do change their minds, at least sometimes when confronted with new facts, but that there's apparently a difference in the way Democrats and Republicans view fact-checking in general. There was Democrats who hold more favorable views of fact-checkers than Republicans and are more likely to change their minds after reading a fact-check. And then there are Republicans whose knowledge increased most when fact-checks reinforced their biases. That's two sort of different approaches to two different things. I hope they are... Do they make sense juxtaposed that way? I mean, they may not, but those are the findings. Okay. This conclusion, or I guess these conclusions, if you don't think that they are mirror images of one another, raises an uncomfortable question. What if telling the truth about the president diminishes the spread of his falsehoods among some groups, but also reinforces Trump's support among base voters while deepening their hostility to the press? The unavoidable reality is that even good behavior by the news media is not sufficient to contain Trump's serial mendacity. Depressing as it may be to say, the lies will get out. It's not only because Trump has more followers on Twitter, 56 million, although who knows how many of them are fake, than any news organization in the world. And it's not only because Fox News, whose primetime stars perform the duties of White House press secretary, averages more total viewers than CNN and MSNBC combined. It's because the communications revolution in technology has created a cluster of information clearinghouses, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and even far-right cult sites such as Gab, where sensational and emotional exaggerations often travel farther and wider than honest reporting and dutiful fact-checking. Sounds like a problem. As the New York Times journalist Kevin Roose has documented, the top-performing stories on Facebook, and we just saw this tweeted around like yesterday, so wow. The top-performing stories on Facebook in the run-up to the midterms were shared by highly partisan websites such as Fox News and RushLimbaugh.com, not traditional reporting-based outlets. I guess I just saw Roose's tweet going around yesterday saying that the top-performing stories at the moment on Facebook were almost all by right-wing outlets, including the top two being Ben Shapiro pieces. On Facebook, in October, 78,000 people shared a fictitious post claiming that Cesar Sayok, the Trump fanatic who mailed bombs to several of the president's enemies, was a false flag operative trying to steal the election from Republicans. That's 28,000 more shares than the New York Times' most viral article of the month. Interesting. So I guess we're talking about October. 78,000 people share the false flag story, but 50,000 was the biggest number of shares that the New York Times was able to muster for anything all month long. It is either narcissistic or outdated or both for traditional media organizations to pretend that they have a monopoly on the power to amplify news. In the mid-20th century, this might have been a realistic notion, but in 2018, even as the media have become an all-purpose bogeyman, the media, without capitalization, that is, the sum total of social media, podcasts, newsletters, and the whole international cacophony of information exchange, have entirely swamped the establishment in power and reach. 4 times as many Americans saw Russian-influenced content on Facebook, about 130 million, than own a print or digital subscription to an American newspaper. That number would be 31 million. So again, 4 times as many Americans saw Russian-influenced content on Facebook as own a print or digital subscription to an American newspaper. That sort of feels like apples and oranges. I mean, did you see Russian influence content on Facebook? Yes, no. Did you see actual news? Yes, no. Versus, do you have a print or digital subscription to an American newspaper? What does that have to do with anything? Did I see news or did I not see it? But you can't measure that, so here's something you can measure, and we mash the two of them together. That's not particularly helpful, and that's the second time I felt like that's happening in this article. Grain of salt for you again. Is it hopeless to smother the president's lies? I mean, this still has the feeling of truthiness to it, right? Doesn't it? The viral descriptor here of the president's lies, that still feels like it's holding true, even if some of these comparisons are not. It is hopeless to smother, is it hopeless to smother the president's lies? In the biggest picture, yes. The news media cannot kill the virus, but by refusing to host it, they can at least limit the spread. Possibly. That is, even as they acknowledge their inability to reform the tens of millions of people predisposed to believe and share the president's nonsense, they can protect their audiences with a combination of selective abstinence, that is, being cautious about giving over headlines, tweets, and news segments to the president's rhetoric, particularly when he's spreading fictitious hate speech. That would be always. And aggressive contextualization, that is, consistently bracketing his direct quotes with the relevant truth. Call it an epistemic quarantine. But if you do, you'll lose your audience. This isn't the case for hopelessness. It's the case for seeing the world as it is, which is the purpose of journalism in the first place. Oh, good. All the responsible press can do is to honor a social compact that, despite the wrenching changes under Trump, remains firmly in place. Seek the truth for those who care to know it. That certainly makes some sense. And that brings us to the end of the piece. By the way, I feel like I have to circle back on things and make certain that we mention that I had to go back and make sure that I have links for you on the White House Correspondents Association dinner foregoing inviting a comedian, and also a piece for you on the White House press rules that can get you ejected for asking follow-up questions. But that also reminds me that I needed to update you on the Acosta story, and I'm not certain that we have, the latest here, because I still see opposite sounding stories being tweeted around, though that looks like they're from yesterday, so it's hard to tell where we are here. But let me at least just add this to the pile, and we can try and sort it out. The Hill, in a piece written and posted yesterday afternoon, but which came to my attention this morning, White House drops bid to revoke Acosta's press pass. We discussed that they were going to look for ways to kick him out anyway under their new rules, but also that they said that they were contemplating revoking his press pass again as soon as the temporary restraining order expired. So this piece by Jordan Fabian in the Hill, the headline hints that they've given up on that. Let's see if that's what's actually happening in the body of the article. I guess here we go again. Once again, you can't just go with the headline. Let's see. The White House is dropping its effort to strip CNN reporter Jim Acosta of his press credentials, a defeat for President Trump in his campaign against the news media. The reversal comes after the White House notified Acosta last Friday that it may renew its attempts to revoke his press pass after a judge's order restoring it expired. Okay, so that's directly addressing that. The White House has set a Sunday deadline for Acosta to object and said it would make a final decision by 3 p.m. on Monday. Okay, I guess had said it, because if that's what they're saying now, then that's not undoing it or not dropping it. Having received a formal reply from your counsel to our letter of November 16th, we have made a final determination in this process. Your hard pass is restored, the White House said in a new letter to Acosta. The letter also outlined new rules for reporters at presidential news conferences. Okay, this takes care of one of our tasks, including limiting each journalist to one question with follow-ups coming, quote, at the discretion of the president or other White House officials taking questions. Should you refuse to follow these rules in the future, we will take action in accordance with the rules set forth above, the White House wrote to Acosta. The president is aware of the decision and concurs. Of course, later on, if he needs to, he can say he wasn't aware of the decision. The White House said any reporter could have their credentials pulled if they do not follow the new rules for news conferences. We have created these rules with a degree of regret, the White House wrote, but given the position taken by CNN, we now feel obligated to replace previously shared practices with explicit rules. CNN applauded the decision to restore Acosta's pass and indicated it would end its lawsuit against the Trump administration over the suspension. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I would ask if the court could sort of hold it in abeyance, should they in fact reverse themselves a second time and opt to attempt to revoke Acosta's pass at the end of the expiration, I guess, of the temporary restraining order after all. And I'd hate to see you have to start all over again. But I guess you could move to dismiss it without prejudice so that you could simply refile it, but I don't see why you should have to go through all that again. Today, the White House fully restored Acosta's press pass. As a result, our lawsuit is no longer necessary. We look forward to continuing to cover the White House, the network said in a statement, which is clearly a tweet because there's all the ats in it here. The White House Correspondents Association said the administration, quote, did the right thing in restoring Acosta's pass, but criticized its new press conference rules. For as long as there have been White House press conferences, White House reporters have asked follow-up questions. We fully expect this tradition will continue, said WHCA President Olivier Knox, adding the group had no role in crafting the rules. We will continue to make the case that a free and independent news media plays a vital role in the health of our republic. The development marked the end of a nearly 2-week-long saga that began when the White House suspended Acosta's credentials on November 7th, following a contentious exchange with Trump at a post-election news conference. You remember the story, of course. Acosta refused to physically surrender a microphone to a White House intern who wasn't an intern, but in fact was a deputy press secretary. Come on, let's get this right. When Trump cut him off after he asked the president multiple questions about the migrant caravan and the Russia investigation, of course. Acosta and Trump have clashed on multiple occasions dating back to the 2016 campaign. The decision triggered widespread outrage among media organizations. CNN filed a lawsuit accusing the administration of violating Acosta's First and Fifth Amendment rights to press freedom and due process, respectively. U.S. District Court Judge Timothy Kelly granted CNN an initial victory last Friday when it ordered the White House to temporarily restore Acosta's pass, indicating the network had a good chance of succeeding on its claims that the reporter's due process rights were violated. He did not rule on CNN's First Amendment claim. Several media organizations have scoffed at the White House's arguments, saying that past presidents have all dealt with aggressive coverage without pulling reporters' credentials. But Trump and his staff have stressed that reporters must follow rules of decorum while inside the White House. We have to practice decorum, the president told reporters last Friday while reacting to the judge's ruling, and then misspelling Adam Schiff's name. The decision to permanently restore Acosta's pass was surprising, and indeed I would say I'm not entirely sure that's what they're doing, given the president's reluctance to back away from a fight. By most indications, the administration was prepared to move forward with its efforts just hours before a final decision was announced. CNN on Monday morning asked Judge Kelly for an emergency hearing after the White House indicated it would suspend Acosta's pass again after the 14-day order restoring it expired. Trump has yet to comment personally on the decision to restore Acosta's pass, but on Sunday he shrugged off the courtroom defeat. It's fine. I mean, it's not a big deal, he told Chris Wallace in an interview for Fox News Sunday. Regarding the new rules and Acosta, Trump said, if he misbehaves, we'll throw him out or we'll stop the news conference. Which, of course, essentially means that they should never have dropped the lawsuit because you're going to have to come back and do it again. Okay, but it wouldn't be such a problem as long as they save the paperwork. They could just file again, and just a little bit of time wasted on that one. Okay. Well, that helps take care of business, bringing you up to speed on what's happening with Acosta, and providing some of the links we need to back up the assertions we made at the beginning of the show about the new rules being issued. Okay. Let's see if we can catch up on other comments that came through. We can see what's going on here. What am I looking at here? Somebody else having some problems too? All right. Well, here we go. Absinthe tweeting, I made the mistake of closing your stream, and when I restarted, I got an error. It's something wrong with Netroots. I've tried different ways to get it to stream, but then 4 or 5 minutes later, oops, it works now. Won't close my stream in case that happens again. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that, but why would you close the stream? That's what I'd like to know. Don't cross the streams, but don't close them either. Okay, other stories that are making the rounds this morning. Washington Post has this story, and I'm not sure what to make of it, but we might as well note it for the record. White House discusses possible Trump visit to troops in Iraq or Afghanistan. They are, of course, discussing this because everyone is noting, quite correctly, he has never visited troops deployed in a combat zone. And most presidents, kind of want to do that. And, if you're in the business of claiming that other people disrespect the troops because they do things like take a knee to protest violence, police violence against minorities, or really everybody, well, then you can't really boast of your respect for the troops when you don't show them any in the most traditional possible manner. And of course, it probably doesn't help. This also came up in the context of his dumping on yet another military figure who happened to disagree with him. And that's a rather amazing development all by itself. But good cause, good opportunity for people to evaluate past behaviors. For instance, just to provide the background here, I grabbed a hold of Kyle Griffin's tweet because everybody grabs a hold of Kyle Griffin's tweets. Not really sure why. He's the aggregator, the most aggressive aggregator on the aggregation system of Twitter. He's sort of a meta Twitter in this. Anyway, he tweets out, he picks up on the Republican Party's, the Republican National Committee's own Twitter feed, in which they say, in reaction to the controversy or the fight as between Donald Trump and Admiral William McRaven, worth noting that after recent comments, retired Admiral William McRaven was reportedly on Hillary Clinton's shortlist for vice president in 2016. He's been critical of President Donald Trump, even dating back to the 2016 campaign. He's hardly a non-political figure. And of course, everybody, we know what they're talking about here. Although I can't recall how or why the fight started, but okay. McRaven is critical of Trump for XYZ. I can't even remember what it is, and it's not that long ago. It's just I never paid attention to what it was in the first place. It's not that I've forgotten. But Trump, shows no trepidation in attacking military figures or veterans. We've seen it before. Of course, we saw it right during his convention. He's attacking Gold Star parents. He's initially, even before then, attacking John McCain. Remember, that was the end of his career. Oh, my gosh, you've gone too far now. I like people who weren't captured, okay? And it didn't work. Nothing happened. And here he is now taking shots at McRaven. And as Kyle notes here, the official GOP account now coming to Trump's defense and attacking Admiral McRaven, the man who led the Osama bin Laden raid. I guess here we're talking about, this would have been this part of the Sunday night conversation that he had with Chris Wallace. And basically, and Wallace saying, "Are you sure you want to do this?" We're talking about the guy who led the Bin Laden raid. Oh, what's so great about that? Essentially, shouldn't we have caught him earlier? Et cetera, et cetera. Belittling the whole thing. It was outrageous to a lot of people. But here we are with the official Republican account now coming to Trump's defense as other people are gasping and clutching at their pearls. And actually, I have something else to say about that one, which is that, I guess it started off with the thought of like, yeah, I'm so old, I remember when. Sort of thing. And what did I remember? And, I came out with a different formulation for it. Basically, I said, look, if you were a Democrat, if you're one of the congressional Democrats in particular, who freaked out and when Move On ran that General Betray Us ad, he freaked out and voted in Congress for resolutions condemning the ad and Move On. And this, how many years, when was that exactly? And how long was it in between defunding Acorn because of the Democratic freak out over James O'Keefe's first splashy doctored video and the Move On freak out where, they weren't able, thankfully, to defund Move On, but they did the one thing that they could do. And I'm just thinking about this. If you were a Democrat who freaked out and voted to condemn Move On for the General Betray Us ad, you need to kick yourself in the gonads immediately. Because, at least in hindsight. I know at the time there were probably lots of Democrats who were of the mind of, again, we do have to distance ourselves from this thing because otherwise we'll be subject to Republican attacks. And that was maybe that was the last time. I think that Democrats should have fallen for that. Democrats should never have fallen for that trick. But, okay, there are dumb people everywhere. And then some of them are Democrats. There are nervous people everywhere. Democrats in general are nervous. And it's a huge weakness that Republicans repeatedly exploit among Democrats. I think we're finally getting to the point where the majority of us are over it. Not necessarily the case with elected officials, but at least the majority of us are over it and can communicate quickly enough to our elected officials that we can prevent mass dashes for the exits immediately by conveying to people, no, don't panic about this. This is another Republican trap. But you remember how that one went. It didn't destroy Move On, but it didn't help. And it did ding its reputation for a long time. I don't know exactly what to make of Move On now at this point anyway. I'm not certain how I measure their relevance. There's something to it. It isn't what it used to be, but I don't know if this is responsible for it. But once again, kick yourself in the gonads if you thought there was going to be any difference in the way Republicans were going to treat you then or in general, because when it comes time for the Republican rank and file to make a decision about whether or not to abandon a prominent Republican or otherwise conservative person, group, entity, what have you, for saying something that could be interpreted the same way as the General Betray Us ad, an attack on an honored military figure, you won't see the same reaction. They're not going to bring a resolution condemning Donald Trump for having said that. They're going to not only not distance themselves, they're going to use their official organs, party organs, to defend the attack. Meanwhile, Democrats were scrambling for the exits and doing everything. They would shoot their own allies in the face for that matter. You shoot yourself in the foot, shoot the allies in the feet, same bullet, damages both, and do anything they can. I got to prove to Republicans so that they don't attack us over our patriotism. We had been very badly beaten and cowed over the Iraq War, about which we were right, and yet here it was. We were worried about being quick enough to distance ourselves from an attack on a military person, and they not only ride it out, they celebrate it and defend it. And so I thought that was an important thing to observe. and add to the mix. It's not exactly where I was going, but that's fine because the break is coming up. It gives us a chance to catch our breath, and then we'll read about the president's, so-called president's, caving to pressure, I guess, and trying to decide exactly how he will visit some deployed troops so that he can avoid our attacks for once. That's an interesting turn of events. I wonder if that's what's really working. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. And it occurs to me that there's something else also quite important, and I guess we'll shoehorn it in here before we get into this piece from the Washington Post. I'm already hedging against reading the whole thing because of the number of things I want to squeeze in here in today's last live show of the week. One, do I bother discussing it all that much? I don't know. Anyway, I guess the story is here also in the Washington Post. Ivanka Trump used a personal email account to send hundreds of emails about government business last year. Yes, you read that right, said Shane Harris, who is describing the scoop from Carol Leonig and, is it Josh Dawsey? It just says J. Dawsey in his handle. And yeah, I've remembered it right. Do I go over it? You've already heard it by now. And I guess the reaction among people whose reaction we actually value here is torn between, yeah, but couldn't we just use this as an opportunity to simply say, this email stuff just never mattered, no matter who did it, and I'll accept not covering this as obsessively when it's about Ivanka Trump in exchange for an apology from the media who screwed up the 2016 election by focusing relentlessly on her emails. And the other side of the coin that said, no, I don't think I'll even take that. I need, I'm waiting to see, even though they know they're never going to get it. I mean, that's the worst part about that side is you're right. You're justified in saying, I demand that there now be days and days, months and months, weeks and weeks. I've gone backwards here. Let's go forward again to years and years of obsessive coverage of but her emails, except this time about Ivanka Trump. I would also accept, by the way, a few days of obsessing about her emails and then some reports about her having pneumonia and being on death's door and running a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza place. But we're not likely to get those either. We're just not going to get, reciprocal coverage of this. And it's because everyone knew that it was stupid in the first place. It's just people hated Hillary Clinton. People in the press hated Hillary Clinton for terrible reasons. And so they just said that there was some awful thing going on here. And it may have something to do. There might not even be a conscious hate of Hillary Clinton. Could still be hate of Hillary Clinton, just not conscious of it. But I think it also has a little something to do with we thought Hillary Clinton was a serious person and a capable government administrator. And email security seems like an important thing. You never know what could leak. And so we're all very disappointed in her, and we feel it very differently than we do about the idiot Ivanka Trump, who no one ever really thought had anything going on, policy-wise, certainly. And so, who cares? This vapid idiot daughter of the vapid idiot president likewise didn't know what the rules were. But there's plenty to get pissed off about, and her stupid, lame excuse, and it might even be true, I didn't know the rules about it. Well, how could you have forgotten? Because she's an idiot, and she never really cared in the first place about any of it, either her father being elected, for that matter, or about Hillary Clinton doing what she did. So who cares? I don't know. So I'm torn about it myself, but I guess we got to at least mention it. And, you could dismiss it with an LOL, YOLO, nothing matters, I guess, even though we just keep declaring that dead and inoperative. But it still feels true, doesn't it? Okay, well, so there's that one, which is at least of some interest. And, of course, a couple other strange things going on. Oh, yes, right, I almost forgot. And, in fact, I did forget to put in my morning post that we're under the cloud of another mass shooting. I see as I'm scrolling back through my Twitter feed the Mercy Hospital shootings in Chicago. And what do you want to say about that one? I don't know. It came just days into the pushback from doctors against the NRA, who the NRA objecting, stay in your lane, doctors. And, of course, immediately followed by a mass shooting at a hospital. That's only going to heat things up, to say the very least. But what do we say now about another mass shooting? It is what it is. And we're going to have to wait and sort this one out and learn what we can learn from it, although there's not much to learn other than, once again, the shooter is essentially a mentally disturbed participant in a domestic dispute that decided to end the dispute with a gun and kill his ex-fiancée where she was working, and then spread the violence around to everybody else too, which is to say, routine. This is what generally drives these mass shootings in the first place, is some weird toxic masculinity. And there's plenty to talk about on that front too. My God, I could do another show on that one. And I actually do have at least one article set aside. We'll see whether it makes it into a pre-taped podcast for this break, or just comes up when eventually, inevitably, the next mass shooting comes around and reminds us of it. There's lots more to go to here. Oh, by the way, just want to stick this one in here too, since we just briefly mentioned the Ivanka Trump thing. One of the esoteric bits that matters, getting pulled out of the clutter by our friend Der Wouter van der Horst, who always finds the minutia here. Running with this photo grabbed from the news sources of Ivanka Trump's taxpayer-funded, by the way, personal assistant, a young woman by the name of Bridges Lamar. Not Bridget, but Bridges Lamar. Breaking the rules, as Wouter points out here, by helping her out at her personal residence. There's a photo of her carrying out of her basement exit security gate at Ivanka and Jared's place, carrying Ivanka's purse with a newspaper in it and a Starbucks coffee. And dressed rather casually. I don't know whether it was a weekend or she just starts every day dressed casually over at the residence, helping. So Ivanka's personal assistant does important stuff like, I have a coffee and a handbag, and I don't want to carry them to the car. Would you carry them to the car for me so that I can walk to the car for my portal-to-portal car service provided by the Secret Service, unencumbered by my own coffee and my own handbag? Very important. Apparently paid for by you and me, because all she is, after all, is a billionaire, and how much can you really expect of her when it comes to paying for personal assistance if that cost can be shifted to the taxpayers? So helpful. Okay. Let's quickly grab at least the most important nugget out of the Dawsey piece, Josh Dawsey and Paul Son on this one. White House discusses possible Trump visit to troops in Iraq or Afghanistan. This should have been done a long time ago. It hasn't been, because Trump is a hypocrite on how he deals with the military. That's the gist of things. But I guess having picked up on the fact that he's being criticized for this, part and parcel of his criticism of McRaven, and others, and the Republican response in backing him up for it. Now President Trump has begun telling advisors, soon, 2 weeks, that he may visit troops in a combat zone for the first time in his presidency, as he has come under increasing scrutiny for his treatment of military affairs and failure to visit service members deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq. We heard the other day that he was saying, or his White House aides were justifying his reluctance to do so by saying something along the lines of, well, he doesn't really believe in their mission in the first place. He doesn't think troops should be in Iraq or Afghanistan. So he doesn't go to visit them because he views it as that would validate the mission, which he doesn't believe in, which is an extraordinary gaffe, an amazing mistake to pile on top of the one he was already making. So that, I hope, is no longer operative. But I got to grab that one and see if I can include that in the roundup. Note to myself about White House aides on excuse for not visiting. Because really, I mean, honestly, what could be better for morale, right, than that? To say, well, the president, the commander-in-chief, doesn't really believe in what you're doing, but he also won't get you out of harm's way. You're just going to have to sit there and do it, and he doesn't even care. I mean, I'll be so good at morale, your head will spin. But thank you for your service, but I don't believe in it, is essentially what's happening, which is incredible. Okay, but back to the article. Trump has so far declined to visit those combat regions, saying he does not want to associate himself with wars he views as failures. Oh, now he's saying that. Okay, good. Now I don't have to search for anything. It's in this article. Wow, that's amazing. He does not want to associate himself with wars he views as failures, according to current and former advisors who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private conversations. Okay, so now it's White House aides are actually saying it, but they're claiming that he says it to them. That's one step closer, I guess, to him actually saying it. Current advisors said Trump is not expected to visit a war zone during the Thanksgiving break, which he will spend at Mar-a-Lago Golf Resort in Florida. Of course, that would be the most natural time to do that, because that's when they're feeling the most lonesome and homesick because of the holiday. Even George W. Bush, dumb as he was, understood that. But the idea of foregoing Mar-a-Lago, I don't think so. The president has often cast himself as a champion of the Pentagon, invoking the strength and size of the military so strongly as his campaign rallies and on Twitter. At the same time, he has frequently criticized U.S. military missions and decisions, while personally attacking some former military leaders, contributing to a complicated relationship with the armed forces he commands. Although he signed off on Defense Secretary Jim Mattis's requests to bolster the American military presence in Afghanistan and Syria and retain the footprint in Iraq, Trump isn't a fan of U.S. military operations there. In meetings about a potential visit, he has described the missions in Iraq and Afghanistan as a total shame, according to the advisors. He also cited the long flights and potential security risks as reasons he has avoided combat zone visits. They said, yeah, no, Sherlock. That's the reason you have to do them, actually. Because they are long flights, because it's hard, because it shows dedication, but you don't understand that. You're a dotard. You're a big lump of, well, whatever. Okay. Questioned last week about why he has not visited American troops deployed in overseas conflicts, Trump indicated during a Fox News interview that a trip was in the works, which is to say that a trip was not in the works until you asked me that, and I found myself embarrassed and put on the spot. I think you'll see that happen. Trump said in the interview with Chris Wallace that aired Sunday, there are things that are being planned. Now there are. Again, they changed Wikipedia, essentially, in order to make it look like this has been in the works for a long time. We don't want to talk about it because of security reasons and everything else. We don't want to talk about it because it wasn't true. The president also repeated his erroneous contention that he was opposed to the Iraq War. The Washington Post fact checker has found that Trump initially expressed support for the invasion. Of course he did. And did not register public objections until more than a year after the war began. I think it was a tremendous mistake. Should never have happened, Trump told Wallace. But this is about the soldiers, sir, Wallace responded. You're right. I don't think anybody's been more with the military than I have as president, except everybody else. In terms of funding, like they care about that. In terms of all the things I've been able to get them, including the vets, Trump has spoken privately about his fears over risks to his own life. Oh boy. According to a former senior White House official who has discussed the issue with the president and spoke on the condition of anonymity to speak candidly about Trump's concerns, he's never been interested in going. The official said of Trump visiting the troops in combat zones, citing conversations with the president. He's afraid of those situations. He's afraid people want to kill him. Oh, yeah, that's probably true. Pressure for Trump to make such a visit has been building for months. Elliot Cohen, a former George W. Bush administration official and Trump critic, has raised the issue regularly in public. The point is American servicemen and women are on the ground in these places, Cohen said in an interview. They are getting killed. I think any good leader would want to see something for themselves, and they would want to do something for the troops other than using them as props. Since Trump took office, about 60 American service members have died while deployed in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, according to Pentagon statistics, including both hostile and non-hostile deaths. Plans for a visit by Trump aren't firm, several advisors said, and the president has only begun saying in recent weeks that it may need to happen. A White House spokesman declined to comment on presidential visits, citing security concerns. He doesn't know when it's going to happen. 2 weeks is the best thing he can say. The president has come under increasing scrutiny for his behavior toward the military in recent weeks. He attacked the former head of U.S. Special Operations Command, retired Admiral William H. McRaven, on Sunday for his role in catching and killing Osama bin Laden, calling him a supporter of Hillary Clinton and saying that the al-Qaeda leader should have been caught sooner in Pakistan. McRaven responded in a statement saying he did not endorse Clinton during the 2016 presidential election. Again, he's running away from that. Instead of saying, F you, you stupid jackass. Maybe he is a Democrat. After all, there's no better evidence that he is a Democrat, but that he distanced himself from something he thought he could be criticized for by Republicans. All right, so now I'm criticizing McRaven. Trump, then on to the skipping the cemetery service, and I should have done that, he now is willing to say. I don't know. There's not much more that I think is worth pulling out of this. There's some historical context, which is kind of interesting, and but that's really it. And you should read the rest of it for yourself, because historical context is always worth having. But we're getting near the end of the show, and a couple other things that we want to enter onto the record. What are they? I don't remember. I've forgotten by now. Let's see. I have to scan through Twitter and Pocket to make sure I get to the rest of them. Yes, right. Okay, here's where I need to be. And a couple of people brought this to my attention. And let's see. Among them were Bruce McFarlane, who I got to open your thing up now and make sure I've got this right. Yeah, okay. So same piece that you're sending me. And also, let's see, who else brought this one to my attention? Oh, there's at least one other person, and if I can't find it right away, how much further do I scroll back? And I appreciate that you would bring this to my attention. Michael Musson also mentioned it, or I guess set the stage for it yesterday. We were talking about Khashoggi yesterday. So, all right, well, we're going to have to stop the search here. We'll leave it with Bruce on this one. Okay, and he wondered kind of about what we were wondering about the other day. Remember when we were musing over why would the United States feel like it was necessary to address the concerns of President Erdogan of Turkey for the Khashoggi assassination? After all, the Khashoggi assassination had been perpetrated by the Saudis. Why are we worried about making things right between us and Turkey when it's Saudi Arabia and Turkey who have to work things out? Well, Bruce posits that maybe this is why Erdogan was demanding a make good from the Trump administration, referring to the news that we'll just go to this piece about it. The Middle East Eye And I think we've called their name before and said, gee whiz, do we know anything about these people and whether or not they're super trustworthy or not? And I think that, too, has come. Validation has come as well. Was it BJ Hutch, our Montreal girl who stood up for Middle East Eye, or was it somebody else? So she's constantly bringing us the Middle Eastern news. So it may have been her. It's a good educated guess, but it might have been another one of you. And I apologize if I can't bring you to mind immediately. But the Middle East Eye has this news on Khashoggi. We just got to get this one on record. We only have 10 minutes to do it. Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, used to be the CIA head, now moved over to Secretary of State. It's a weird move, and I don't like it, and I was never a fan of the idea of seamlessly moving CIA to state. That really bothered me. But anyway, Pompeo handed Riyadh a plan to shield MBS from the Khashoggi fallout, says source. So first, over the weekend, we find out that the CIA has reached the conclusion that, yes, it was Mohammed bin Salman who ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Then, simultaneously, we found out that the president, who had inched toward agreeing that, yes, the Saudis were probably responsible for that murder, backing away again once it was being laid at the feet of MBS, and then expressing some doubt, trying to find a way to wriggle out of this one. But at the same time, in fact, before he does that, we've sent Mike Pompeo to Riyadh, and everybody was sort of astonished watching Mike Pompeo, the American Secretary of State, shaking hands and making nice with the guy who everybody kind of knew at that point, and the CIA was already reaching the conclusion and almost ready to announce that was responsible for the murder of Khashoggi. But hey, that's statecraft for you. Murderers shake hands for the cameras all the time. That's true. Now, it gets a little worse. The U.S. Secretary of State gave Mohammed bin Salman a roadmap to insulate himself from the scandal, a senior Saudi source tells MEE, Middle East Eye. Why is anybody doing that for him at all? And what in the world are we doing it for ourselves? David Hurst, Daniel Hilton are the bylines on the byline for Middle East Eye on this piece. Saudi Arabia, I say, not them. Saudi Arabia's king and crown prince are shielding themselves from the Jamal Khashoggi murder scandal, and I think everybody expected that they would try, by using a roadmap drawn up by the U.S. Secretary of State, which I think nobody guessed was going to happen. A senior Saudi source has told Middle East Eye. Mike Pompeo delivered the plan in person during a meeting with the Saudi king, that is King Salman, and his son, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, last month in Riyadh, said the source, who is familiar with Pompeo's talks with the Saudi leaders. How is this leaking? The plan includes an option to pin the Saudi journalist's murder on an innocent member of the ruling Al Saud family in order to insulate those at the very top, the source told MEE. That seems extraordinarily dumb. Like it's not even particularly believable. That person has not yet been chosen, the source said, and Saudi leaders are reserving the use of that plan in case the pressure on bin Salman, also known as MBS, becomes too much. When I say it's not believable, I mean, how would anybody be convinced that some other random member of the royal family did this, other than the king or the crown prince? Does anybody else have that kind of juice? And are they going to pick somebody who's imprisoned in the Ritz-Carlton, like they snuck a message out to somebody? That I don't know if there's anybody in the royal family who's innocent, who they're willing to sacrifice, who the rest of the world would believe could have ordered that hit. And it's not I didn't mean to imply, although I suppose it's worth questioning, how trustworthy could this story possibly be? Not that I think Middle East Eye made it up, but what in the world is Mike Pompeo? There's no real explanation in my mind that makes any sense why Pompeo would be doing this. So are we sure that they are doing it? The U.S. State Department, will continue, denied the Saudi source's allegations, of course, and called them a complete misrepresentation of the Secretary's diplomatic mission to Saudi Arabia. But you know how you read Trumpster comments. That must mean it's true. We've spoken publicly about our goals to impress upon Saudi leadership the seriousness to which the United States government attaches it's bad syntax. We'll have to get rid of one of these twos. The seriousness which the United States government attaches to a prompt and complete accounting of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which I also don't really believe, but it's a better sentence anyway. That's what State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert, remember her, told the Middle East Eye. According to the source, Pompeo outlined his plan on October 16th. I reversed that because they're very Euro, 16 October, when he jetted over to Riyadh to meet with King Salman and MBS as international scrutiny on the Khashoggi case intensified. Pompeo's trip to the Gulf Kingdom came exactly 2 weeks after Khashoggi, a prominent journalist and critic of the Crown Prince, was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on 2 October. Just days before Pompeo touched down in Riyadh, MEE reported that Turkish officials had discovered that Khashoggi was killed and dismembered minutes after he entered the consulate to get the papers he needed to remarry. At the time of Pompeo's trip to Riyadh, top U.S. officials, including U.S. President Donald Trump, had said very little about what happened to Khashoggi, who had been living in self-imposed exile in the U.S. at the time of his disappearance. Pompeo's meeting with MBS in Riyadh raised eyebrows as human rights groups worldwide were urging Washington to demand answers from its allies in Saudi Arabia. The day after the high-profile meeting, Pompeo told journalists that the Saudis didn't want to talk about the facts in Khashoggi's case, and neither did he. Inconvenient. The Saudi source told MEE that Pompeo went to Riyadh to advise the Saudis on how to handle the fallout in the Khashoggi case, which is extraordinary. After his meetings, however, Pompeo said he advised the Saudis to conduct a transparent investigation. He would have to say that. We had direct and candid conversations. I emphasized the importance of conducting a thorough, transparent, and timely investigation, and the Saudi leadership pledged to deliver precisely on that. My assessment from these meetings is that there's a serious commitment to determine all the facts and ensure accountability, including accountability for Saudi Arabia's senior leaders or senior officials. The Trump administration is expected to make a formal statement on Tuesday, I guess that's today, about the U.S.'s findings so far in relation to Khashoggi's murder. Late last week, the CIA said it had concluded that MBS ordered the journalist's killing. Several U.S. media outlets reported, but Trump has since moved to cast doubt on the U.S. intelligence agency's findings. Pompeo's plan for the Saudi leadership included several steps, the Saudi source said, when Pompeo declared on 18 October that Saudi Arabia should be given a few more days to complete its investigation into the case. He was giving them time to begin implementing his plan, the source said. They, that is the Saudi leadership, have done everything he wanted to execute, the source said. Since Pompeo's visit to Riyadh, the Saudis have allowed Turkish investigators into their Istanbul consulate, offered to coordinate a joint Saudi-Turkish investigation, sent a team to Istanbul to pursue the probe, and arrested at least 21 suspects. The remaining step, pinning the crime on a member of the royal family, may be taken if the arrests of those Saudi suspects don't work to ease the pressure on Riyadh, the source said. Meanwhile, MBS and King Salman have toured Saudi Arabia, made public appearances at a major investor conference in Riyadh, which I understand was kind of a flop, and met with the journalist's sons, which was disgusting, actually. So far, Riyadh's official investigation into Khashoggi's murder has implicated two of bin Salman's closest allies, Deputy Intelligence Chief Ahmed al-Asiri and top aide Saud al-Qahtani. Both men have been relieved of their jobs. However, according to the Saudi source, they are expected eventually to retake positions of influence in Saudi Arabia. Middle East Eye understands that neither Asiri nor Qahtani are among 5 Saudi suspects the country's public prosecutor said would be facing the death penalty if convicted of ordering and committing the murder. Last Thursday, the Saudi prosecutor said the leader of the Saudi team sent to kill Khashoggi in Turkey, widely believed to be MBS's bodyguard, Maher Abdulaziz Mutrib, made the decision on his own to have Khashoggi killed. Now, that's something that they could probably lie and nobody could prove differently about. It would actually make some sense if it was not particularly believable. But an innocent member of the royal family? Turkish President Erdogan said that the order to kill Khashoggi came from the highest levels of the Saudi leadership. However, he said in a Washington Post column that he does not believe King Salman was involved in the murder. The kingdom maintains that MBS had no knowledge of the assassination plot. and subsequent attempts to cover it up, however. 7 members of the death squad sent to kill Khashoggi were members of bin Salman's personal security detail, MEE has previously reported. Not sounding very good and not very, offering us very much in the way of answers. Good timing, though, I guess, as we head out for the Thanksgiving break. I don't know how many follow-up questions, A, would be allowed and B, will be asked about that one. But this thing keeps inching ever closer to the, at one time, outrageous explanation that this was somehow driven by the White House as much as by the Saudi royal family. Very weird. Well, that's it for the live shows for this week. West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is up next, and they'll be covering any number of stories that we missed, and all of them are fascinating. Do stay tuned for that and more for the rest of the week.
On netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Lots of great stuff on the Cookbook and Speakeasy, including Tennessee police who had descended on a black man with guns drawn after a neighbor heard him recite a Jay-Z lyric. Very scary. A local NRA leader demands secession from Washington after a state gun control initiative won big. That sounds pretty wacky, too. Stay tuned for all that and more.